Not every organization wants to rock the world with its ideas. Some organizations want to stay the course. So, how do you elevate ideas and take them to scale within a profession? Today, I speak with Trevor Merriden. He began his career working as an economist at the Bank of England, and he has worked as an editor with the Economist Intelligence Unit, as well as HR Magazine. He's now the managing director of Merriden Media. He and I have had fantastic conversations around disruptive ideas within organizations, and we're going to dig deeper today. What happens when an organization doesn't want a disruptive idea? What happens when a whole field is being disrupted and transformed? And how do you guide an idea to scale during disruption? I'm Bill Sherman, and you're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. Ready? Let's begin. Welcome to the show, Trevor.
It's great to be here, Bill.
So I want to talk about data-driven thought leadership. And you had the opportunity early in your career to be working with the Bank of England and working with numbers and telling stories through numbers. And let's start there about storytelling. How did that come about in terms of the stories you were telling?
Well, I mean, obviously this is a podcast all around thought leadership, but originally, before I was ever a words nerd, I was a numbers nerd, and I trained university as an economist, and I was thinking about what sorts of places to apply to, and one of the places was the Bank of England. And so I was actually, for the first 4 years of my career, I was an econometrician, which is a cross between an economist and a magician. I think they sort of make things up a lot of the time from numbers. But I found that I was quite good at telling stories, so around the numbers. So I started my writing there, and that's when I started to embrace words. And I enjoyed that whole craft and art. But what I didn't enjoy was the sort of 13 or so layers of bureaucracy that were above me in the Bank of England, between me and the governor. And the aim of a lot of the Bank of England's material at that time, as the fulcrum of stability in the financial system, was to say precisely nothing. And so I would come out with interesting, radical articles, to write, and they would get toned down through all these layers of bureaucracy. And I remember once I said to my boss, but what I've written, it just means precisely nothing now. And my boss smiled and nodded wisely and said, yes, that's precisely what we meant to achieve, because where you have stability, you have safety. And so in that context, my work with numbers kind of was a blunt weapon, if you like. That was through bureaucracy. But then I went on to sort of find sort of joy in thought leadership through numbers and other ways as well, sort of beyond that.
So I want to stay on the story at the Bank of England for a moment. You had said that you were looking through the data, looking for the story. And I think there are a lot of people who are intrigued at how to use data to be more convincing, clear, and compelling. How do you use data effectively to tell a story?
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that I think it's within the gift of anyone with patience, or even with, they might not regard themselves as particularly numerate, but a lot of it is like an act of wonder and curiosity. It's like looking at stars in the sky, and you see a star over there and you see a star over there. And then, and in the past, we might have joined those up in our mind and formed sort of constellations. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm looking at little points of data, something, 53.7% of people believe this and 47%. And what I'm doing is I'm effectively drawing the constellation, so that could be our Orion's belt, or that could be another constellation. And by doing that, I start to draw a picture, and I start to sort of imagine things. So it's a half data, but it's also half curiosity. And I have, in my mind, and I think this is within the gift of almost anybody really, is to have that sense of curiosity, around what you're looking at, not just a number, but to actually think, well, what does this mean? What is this trying to tell me? And I sort of effectively spend my time joining the dots or forming constellations.
Well, and that curiosity, which is something that can be nurtured through your life at any point, also then has to exist within an organizational structure, right? Mm. The ability to ask a question, find an answer, and share the answer. And so the story that you tell is sometimes the organization doesn't want to investigate or put out insights in the same way.
Yeah, they know perfectly well that there is a story there, but that in that particular case, that wasn't the purpose of the organization as they saw it at the time. I think things have loosened up a bit now at the bank, that
Right.
they feel they can say things like that. But this is back in the 1980s. I mean, it was a reason why I then went on to sort of pursue other areas in sort of thinking and developing, and the curiosity which led on to thought leadership. But it was also another reason why I left the bank within a couple of years.
Right. So with that, the curiosity plus being in the right environment that supports the curiosity. And so if you're a leader, you can have an entire organization that has curiosity, but if they don't feel that they're supported to tell those stories won't turn into thought leadership that goes across the organization or out to your audience.
Yeah, and I think that's a really crucial point, Bill, because I've seen a lot of curious, in the good sense, individuals sort of in organizations who have often felt they're sort of plowing a lonely furrow, sort of in terms of doing things. And those are the people, that other people in businesses refer to as, oh, well, they're the odd one out, or they don't really fit in here, or they're not our kind of people. Actually, they probably should be your kind of people, because these rough diamonds or lonely, sort of furrowers are the people who very often have the greatest sort of imagination things can spark of. And I think organizations need to, and I think they're getting a bit better now, need to tolerate those people who do ask the why questions several times. We expect of our 5-year-olds, to continually ask why, sometimes to the point of distraction. But nevertheless, it's a good question, and I guess I never really got out of the habit of asking that question. Thank goodness.
Well, and let's pivot there because the why question leads to your next step in your career, which was a journalistic one, right? And that curiosity continued as you started in, as you described it, the personnel world of corporate Britain at the time. But as it was in an inflection point, moving from personnel to HR. So talk about your work in journalism and how that expectation shift came about.
Yeah, well, originally, I moved from the bank into what was first economic journalist at the Economist Group, and then I moved into sort of mainstream business journalism, and then via circuitous route, I ended up on this magazine called HR Magazine, where it was a profession at the time that was still finding its feet in this country. In the UK, it was called the personnel department. In some places in the UK, it still is called the personnel department. And but personnel was very much seen as an administrative where you go to when things break down, in relations between employees. It was very tactical, very admin-y. And the magazine itself that I was suddenly found myself in charge of, they said, Trevor, you'll enjoy this because you'll meet lots of people, lots of people. And in HR professionals, they're lovely. They love to talk. And so I found that was the case. But what I found was that they were searching for this sense of strategy in what they were doing. They were wanting to move from a tactical profession to a strategic profession. So I decided to make it my mission to use whatever tools and means available to kind of give them confidence in themselves and to realize that they could raise their sights and whether within their organization, push their sphere of influence, or if they couldn't do that within their organization, much in the same way that I couldn't use the numbers effectively back at the bank, then I felt strongly that they should probably go somewhere else, go to an organization that was more enlightened. I didn't become a recruitment agent in that sense. I was still an editor, but just trying to raise the aspirations of HR professionals. So we did that with some success, and in terms of raising the sights of the profession. Of course, that was happening all over the place. It wasn't just happening in the UK, but in the US and so on. And there's still a long way to go for the HR profession. And but that's what we were trying to do in terms of raising those aspirations. You're not personnel, you're HR. You're not just HR, you're strategic HR. And you're not just strategic HR, you are serving the needs of the business in doing so.
There's a parallel here that I want to pause on in the world of HR and thought leadership, right? So thought leadership as a function sometimes in some organizations is coming out of a content group, right? Or content marketing. And all of a sudden they're told, oh, you're doing thought leadership now. Let's talk a little bit about that evolution from content to thought leadership to strategic thought leadership that aligns with the business. And
Mm.
maybe there are some lessons that you sort of learned and saw as the HR profession was going
Yeah,
through that transformation.
yeah, it's a really it's a really important transition. I mean, in any profession, I found that in my own profession, and I found it in the profession I was looking at, and you're right, they did sort of feed off each other in my mind, at least, and just as the journey of HR was that sort of aspirational journey, I found that myself, that I was because I was kind of reasonably numerate, I was starting to look into it. HR started to produce a lot more data around it. And so I was able to talk in a more strategic way. And when I was able to talk in a more strategic way to the HR community, it raised my own sort of aspirations about what I could do with content and what I could do with then thought leadership, and then thought leadership being used to serve the needs of businesses. At that point, my business was, I was an internal person. I was working as an editor on a magazine. But I started to become a bit restless myself, that a magazine was a narrow construct. And actually, I thought, well, I could go and help lots of businesses. I could move beyond the magazine environment and do this beyond what many people regard as journalism. I could provide content, provide thought leadership, help the strategy that served the businesses, lots of businesses, sort of beyond that.
So we've talked about you as an economist. We've talked about you as a journalist and an editor. When did you start becoming self-aware that you were doing thought leadership?
Well, I moved from the magazine eventually for various sort of family reasons. I had 3 kids under the age of 5 at the time, and I realised that one of the PR businesses that was pitching into me, there's not many that pitch in well to magazines, but one business that did, I found out happened to be sort of on my doorstep and literally 10-minute walk away. And I joined this thing, and I joined it because it was a very strategic communications consultancy, and they were really into thought leadership. They served their clients by, writing thought leadership and so on. And I was a director of this business. We grew that business quite a lot, and I was getting people in to help me at that point in terms of the writing. But I realized that the skill that I had picked up in journalism, plus the consultative skill that you pick up in working in, professional services, in consulting, actually served me very well to actually write that thought leadership myself. So that was the first awakening, if you like. 3 or 4 years later, we'd done everything we could with that business. I decided to go start my own business purely in that area around sort of content and thought leadership. And for the first, if I'm honest with you, Bill, for the first 2 years, I was all about survival. It was about, it's about you set up your own business and you, as my wife said, I'll try and avoid the crudities here. She said, "I love you, I support you, but you've got 2 years and don't F it up." And so I got to 2 years and I realized I hadn't and that things were going well. At that point, I was kind of taking almost any piece of content work. But at that point, I thought, well, now in keeping with some of the early conversation, I can raise my sights, if you like. I can develop my own sense of, what I really want to do is I want to focus in very clearly on thought leadership. And so that was probably the short answer to your question, was about sort of 7 or 8 years ago now, I would say. And I've been doing that ever since.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. So, in terms of understanding thought leadership, it sounds like it was an evolutionary process for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, like many people who have become practitioners, an accidental thought leadership practitioner rather than a planned one. I want to
Yeah.
ask you, how do you define thought leadership today?
Well, it's been, obviously, more about the sort of the history and origin of thought leadership. I've seen various accounts in terms of how it is defined. To me, thought leadership is as good as the master that it serves, if you like. The business strategy. I make this very strong connection, just like I did on the magazine, and just like I did in terms of helping clients, when I was working in the PR business, and just as I do now. The really thought leadership is good when you are literally putting on the shoes of the customer or client or membership organization that you are serving. And that really what I see about is that it is really acting as the clarion call, the voice of the senior business community within a business, the messages that they want to get out, a genuine message, that would resonate not just externally in terms of elevating the brand, but also internally in terms of providing clarity for everybody within the business for understanding the purpose of what they do. If you've got those two things, if you're showing a genuine profile for external sort of thought leadership, but showing what your brand is all about, and you're combining it right deep down, right the way through with an internal resonance so that the people at all levels of the organization understand why they're doing it. And thought leadership is a fantastic vehicle for that.
You talk about the importance of strategy. And I would say over my almost 20 years now in the field, I think strategy in thought leadership is the piece that's often most overlooked. People know they need ideas. They know they need some sort of execution to get the idea out into the world, but they don't connect the thought leadership to the business objectives and goals. And they just hope by putting smart ideas out there, magic happen.
Yeah.
And I've seen that breakdown again and again. Have you?
Yes. So it's the very short answer to the question, but to expand on it, I mean, you must have had this, Bill, that somebody phone you up or email you, or you have a conversation, and they always say, we feel we should be making more of our content, Trevor. And I was going, oh, really? What makes you think that? And I think we've got some ideas. I think we just do. I say, well, tell me what your ideas are. And so they tell me what their ideas are. And they're looking. It's like them looking through a telescope the wrong way around, as far as I'm concerned. They and the question, I then sort of, it gets to the point where they might be floundering around and so on. And I say, look, let's ask a simpler question. What are you trying to tell me about your business? Tell me what you're trying to achieve. Tell me what are the things that are most important to you over the next 3 months, 6 months, year, and what are you trying to achieve through that? How do the thoughts in your business sort of fit into that? How does your thought? How is your thinking, your strategy supporting that? And then, and only then, can we ask the question of how does the content that we're talking about actually work to support that? Just in the same way, earlier in the conversation, we talked about how does HR support the business strategy. So probably the biggest lesson I ever learned, was back in the editing days, was when I was writing an editorial and I showed it to my editor-in-chief at the time, and he said, if you were the reader reading this, what would you think? And I sort of then started to articulate, how actually I would look at that paragraph and think, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, or this guy doesn't really understand my world. And I answered my own questions, and he just smiled, didn't say anything else to me, but just walked off. And I then rewrote the editorial. Exactly the same now, in thought leadership is that what, dear business leader, would your customer think if they read this piece of thought leadership? Does that raise the issues and help to answer the issues that you are thinking of, that maybe are at the kind of fuzzy edge of your thinking at the moment? You don't know exactly that it's articulating a problem that you think that you may have, but you haven't had time to deal with it. And it'll bring it from that fuzzy edge right into the center in the front of your mind. We must do something about this now.
One of the reasons that I love your story about the Bank of England is because it brings these principles to life so clearly. And that's why it sticks with me. One, you had the idea and the insight, and you said, hey, I can tell this story.
Yeah.
Your manager looked at it and said, no, but that's not the story we're trying to tell. And you're out of alignment with what we've articulated as our objectives for the organization.
Yeah.
And then the expectations of the readers beyond the organization. And
Yeah.
so, what I guess I would ask is if you were going back and had the opportunity to talk to yourself in the Bank of England days, what advice on practicing thought leadership might you give to a younger Trevor?
Oh, crikey, that's a great question. Oh God, I would love that opportunity to go back. But if I say, okay, let's imagine here we are. So younger Trevor, sort of says, I'm writing these pieces. I've got some great stories here. Every time my draft comes back, it's got big red lines through it, and they're taking out all the fun out of my article. And my older Trevor will say, well, don't look at these red lines. You can understand the reasons why they have done that in a technical sense, that they say that their organization's purpose is not to make waves, not to create controversy and so on. But maybe you could get some more things through if you appealed to your bosses and the bosses about the reader instinct as well. What would people reading the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin or other similar austere publications, what are they going to get? Well, they're going to get what they want is some clarity to go away and easily know that the bank stands for something. I would try and argue this. I think within that environment, I was on a bit of a losing wicket, as we say in this country. So I don't know if I would have got very far, but I would have felt myself feeling more at peace with myself. And I probably would have made my decision quicker with older Trevor talking to younger Trevor to move on and to work in a freer environment. I probably stayed there a year or two too long. I was there 4 years in all. And then I realized there was a world where there weren't 13 layers of bureaucracy. And actually you could get your message across. You could go and talk directly to your readers if you wanted to. And I found that a tremendously liberating experience. Wonderful place, Bank of England, but it wasn't my long-term career.
So we've taken a trip into the past with advice, and I think that is a good piece of figure out and understand the goals of the organizations from where you sit. You may need to ask questions and understand what are your boss and your boss's boss trying to achieve, and then align. And as you said, you can drop pieces into that. We've looked in the past. Let's look in the future now. Where do you see thought leadership going? What are the things we need to work on to make it more effective?
Right. Okay. We've mentioned one of them already that I found, and I'm not just saying it because I think it's innately within myself, the curiosity side of things. I think organizations cannot afford to not be curious anymore. The pandemic has shown us two things. One is how terrible a pandemic is. Number two is that in that adversity, all sorts of magnificent things actually did happen within organizations where people were able to achieve things that had previously been in the too difficult pile. That, I think, has sort of raised some people's level of consciousness around curiosity about what if we did it this way? What if we had to do this? What if the world was about to end and we had no choice but to do this? So we face an existential crisis. Curiosity is one of those things. I think a focus in the future on clarity that you will know, Bill, through many thought leadership projects that very often, you may get people within an organization who have competing views about what they are there to do and the business the business objectives, what they're doing. The real future of thought leadership, I think, is about achieving this sense of clarity. You can distill and distill and distill lots of different ideas, but you have to distill it in a way that is a clear but not bland as a result, in the way that my Bank of England articles turned out to be. And then finally, I'd say there's a thing around collaborative thought leadership. We have a lot of, we talk about gurus, we talk about sort of experts, and we think about thought leadership. Perhaps some people might think of thought leadership as a slightly painful experience where a kind of guru or an isolated figure sits in a room for hours on end and then has a little spark of genius, writes it all down. Everybody says, all hail the genius. This is thought leadership. Of course, it's not like that. And increasingly, the best thought leadership for the increasingly knotty problems in the world, are formed through collaborations of all sorts. It's not new to say that people are collaborating to get answers, but I think it's an accelerating trend and something that we're going to see a lot more of, and I think that's fantastic. So I hope that those three C's of curiosity, clarity, and collaboration sort of are part of the future. Very fortunately for a thought leadership writer, they all begin with the letter C, so that makes life easy, doesn't it?
I was appreciating the mnemonic as you were creating it, and I'm like, I wonder if he'll land a third C, and you sure did. So I want to stay on this collaborative piece for just a moment and underscore it. One of the things that I've watched over the last year or two is this accelerating flow of ideas across the world. It used to be you had to get on a plane or be on calls, and ideas seem to travel more slowly. And one of the things that I think, because of the adoption of Zoom and social media and that, for good or for ill, ideas can travel faster. And so one of the things that I look at is, how do we use thought leadership more effectively so that good ideas are traveling faster and that our problems are solved and solutions implemented more quickly?
Yeah. I mean, certainly there is an accelerated pace in that. And part of it is that, despite the fact that we've all for years said, it's better to meet face to face, isn't it? The truth of the matter is that it's a big time saver. And and you think about the pluses of us, talking like this at the moment. We're talking sort of virtually, and we're sharing ideas and so on. I could have got on a plane, and traveled over to Vegas to see you. I mean,
that's a 9-hour flight minimum.
Yeah, I'd be knackered at the end of that. I'd be tired. My brain would be addled, and I'd have jet lag for 2 or 3 days. And the quality of any ideas that I might have had when I left Heathrow, might have disappeared by the time I turned up at your house. So I think there is clearly an improvement in that sense. I think there's lots of pros, in terms of thought leadership and the ability and the tools and the technology for sharing ideas and the ease of sharing projects and working on things. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people I now work with who I've never actually met. And, it's astonishing, but I just kind of get on with it. If they don't mind, I don't mind. And we just do that. I do think we've got to have a voice of caution, though, that just in the same way that if I get on a plane tomorrow and come and meet you, Bill, and then I see you and I think, oh, he's a bit taller than I thought, or, he's not, he looks different, sort of you meet him sort of face to face, or you get a different impression, or you see somebody's wider perspective of their life. In the same way, I think that the flat screen thought leadership world, if you like, does risk losing some voices as well. If you are in a meeting where, there's a mixture of sort of senior and junior people, for example, or a big one of those big Zoom meetings that some people were trying to turn their screens off and I sometimes think the quietest voice in the room, as the room used to be when we met up round a table, a good chairman or CEO or whoever sort of would say, and what do you think, to the person? Very often that person with the quietest voice has the most interesting point of view. And I think some of that risks getting lost, I think, in the virtual world where it's probably a bit too easy to not make a contribution in a meeting, even if your view is of value. It's something I worry about. I haven't got any evidence to back that up, Bill, but it's something I wonder. I do worry about the flat screen thought leadership world.
So a couple thoughts on that to build as we wrap up here. One, I think that as you look at thought leadership, it is easy to go to the usual suspects again and again, right? And I think that's always been true, but it's been made more visible. And let me articulate that, right? So if you were to go back in the business world, right, look at who was practicing thought leadership 20, 30 years ago, whether thought leadership was defined as a business book or a publication, a prestige publication such as HBR, that had its own gatekeeping limitation, either through publishers and editors. And now, because of the accelerated pace, we can be on a Zoom together with 40 people. Yeah. We can be at least aware and see a box on the screen where someone is silent, where that person wouldn't have been even visible in the room before.
Yeah. I think that's true. That there is a case that I think the question is, as within any vehicle or medium that you use, I think it's all about awareness and making sure that everybody has the chance to communicate their ideas. And I've seen good Zoom meetings and I've seen bad Zoom meetings, where I felt that some people were effectively shut out because people had been sort of on a bit of a monologue about something. But I've also seen them conducted very well. And I've seen good meetings and bad meetings. So what happens is you have to change the parameters and just make it as easy as possible for people to feel that they can contribute without fear or favor.
Well, and to build on that, I would say thought leadership is about taking ideas to scale. And so if you have responsibility within your organization, you can either go back to your usual suspects again and again and help take their ideas to scale, or you can cast a wider net and ask that person, like you said earlier, the chair who says, well, what do you think? Right. And truly listen. And sometimes you have to be persistent and proactive within the organization and encourage people to share, because they may demur the first time or the second time, even though they've got a great idea that they've been sort of noodling on constantly, right?
Yeah, and you just made me think of a really good example of that. An organization that I work with here in the UK, MBNA, which is part of the Bank of America, and we had a long story short, I was put in charge of the sort of content management platform, about developing a community within that, and we did that in the organization, and increase that from about a dozen to 2,000 people. One of those people, those 2,000, was a guy who was quite low down in an organization, that when there were some big floods in this country a few years back, he had a brilliant idea about notifying all the people who were affected by the flooding areas that their credit terms would be eased, for the period of duration for 6 months afterwards, that they wouldn't have to pay back any of their loans or anything like that during that time. And he suggested that as an idea. And the joy of technology, pre-pandemic days, but it's still a joy, was that it was picked up by the CEO, the finance director, the HR director within about an hour, who said, come and present this at the board meeting. His first reaction was, oh my God. His second reaction was, I'm going to source ideas through exactly the same medium. So we asked people over at the Bank of America for advice on how they dealt with various floods in situations before. And then he was there at a board meeting, this guy who had never been expected to be in that kind of environment, presented ideas. They said, we love it. We'll have somebody to work with you on this project, support you. And they implemented it within a few weeks. Whereas, in most organizations in the past, that leadership from below, if you like, would not have registered, or it would have been never percolated up within the organization. Great idea, sort of, that was then seized upon and used for competitive advantage.
Well, and ideas can get trapped in organizational paralysis and bureaucracy. And so finding a way, if you think about the organization as a creator of ideas, and that if you're hiring smart people, skilled people, regardless of what level in the organization, if you think of one of the outputs of the organization is better ideas, you need to be looking deep in the organization and encouraging those people, because maybe they don't crack the code and have that winning or sort of game winning idea today, but they're your future.
Oh, absolutely. And they're a future of any organization that wants to survive, I think.
Right.
And, survive and then thrive in the period ahead. I think the days are long gone where, anybody could afford to lead a largely inert workforce who just kind of went in and did the same thing day in, day out. You've got to be restless, you've got to be curious, you've got to be clear, and you've got to be collaborative.
Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but let's leave it on those three C's. I want to thank you, Trevor, for joining us in the conversation today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, Bill.
If you're interested in organizational thought leadership, then I invite you to subscribe to the OrgTL newsletter. Each month, we talk about the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organizations. Go to the website orgtl.com and choose Join Our Newsletter. I'll leave a link to the website as well as my LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing what you thought of the show.